So I'm going to start recording. Okay, it's recording now. All right, so as I said, important things. Today's March 23rd, covering PHP. Keep in mind, we have exam 2 on March 30th. All right, let's go ahead and switch over to our virtual machine. So, and let's go ahead and get started with that. Okay, so you should be seeing the virtual machine now. And today we're just going to continue with our examples of PHP. Okay, so we've done a few, enough that you could have gotten started with the homework. We'll talk about the homework on Thursday. So we'll get into that. So today I'm just going to do some simple examples, or some more examples, I should say. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about the homework. And then we get into the, a few last topics in PHP, how to make database connections. And then also just finally, the last thing is to kind of build a website that is in MVC. So we're going to just spend all of our time building one single website in MVC format that is also, it has a user login and password and all of those little details. Okay, so today we're going to do an example of object-oriented programming. So I think that's the topic that I did not cover before spring break. Okay, so that's kind of where we are in the semester. So this will be similar to what we were doing before. It'll be 3 files, kind of to organize our information better. So, starting with this, continuing with this idea of model view control. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up the terminal. Open up the terminal here. And I'm going to go to the var ww folder as usual. And then we can go into our ITS 362. Okay. And if you remember, this is where we were, kind of going over the problems. Right, so you can see these are all kind of the problems that we worked on since last week. Right, okay, so today we're going to continue. The last one that we did, I think, was getter post, and we also did both form and logic. Yeah, so I think both form and logic, this one was actually the last example we did in class, I think Thursday before spring break. So now we're just going to continue. This one's a bit, it's similar. It's a similar type, obviously. It's going to be a little bit longer, but that's, that's just more examples, basically, of PHP. So in this, what we're going to do now is we're going to do object-oriented, right? So you guys, you already know how to program. You know what object-oriented is, so I'm not going to describe what that is. Instead, we're just going to go over how to do it in PHP for our website. So what we're going to need or end up needing is an HTML page. We're going to need the class, right, product. So we're going to sell products, continue with our way of doing things. And then we're also going to have a form. So the form where you enter the data and then store the data in a class, basically. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to basically create 3 files. 2 are going to be PHP files, and 1 will be an OOP file. So let's start with that one. Go ahead and do that. So it's going to be, let's call it just OP dot HTML. Okay. So this is going to be our HTML file. So we can go ahead and do, HTML, right? HTML. Okay. And let's just add, the usual things. So let's add the head section. So let's kind of remind ourselves of how we do this from scratch. Okay. So we got the head section, then we're going to have the body section. Body section. All right. And here, basically this, this is pretty much what we've done before. Let's maybe just add like a simple heading here, H3. Let's just say OP example. Okay, so we have that. And then we can create, our form basically. So let's just do form, action, and let's just say OP dot, PHP. So we're going to call a PHP file. Okay. And, the methods, just keep it simple. So we're going to use the get method. So we can do get. All right. And close it. Then over here, we can close the form. Okay. And then now we can proceed to just add the individual parameters. So we've got product ID, and let's just say input type equal text. All right, so it's our input. Let's give it a name. So let's just say, product ID, the same thing we've been using before. Product ID. And then let's close it. Set a break line. All right. Then we can do the next one, which is going to be, the product name, basically. Product name, input, type, and then this one's going to be text as well. All right, and here we have name equal product name. Okay. The BR with that. So we've got our product ID, our product name, and just like before, so nothing here has changed. And then we can proceed with BR. Okay. So now in here, let's just add the button. Some kind of you can do this in many ways. Let's just do input type equal submit and a value which will be, let's just say send here. Okay, so we've got this pretty much, standard approach. So if I didn't make any mistakes, this should work just fine. Now the key question is, this form then will send data. So let's go ahead and save it. So Control X, Y, enter. Now we can go to, this is test 2. So let's go to the browser. Okay, and we can do localhost, right? And then here, test 2, right? And you can see our files there. And we are working with OPHTM. Right, there it is. So that's our, basically our form working just fine. Now that's pretty easy and straightforward. Now the next step is we need to figure out the class, right? So we're going to have a basic logic where we bring in the data, you know, from the request or the get array, and then we display it, right? So that, you know, that's pretty straightforward. Also, we can go back to our terminal. Click on the terminal here. Now we're going to create a new file, and this file can be op.php, so the page that we just called from the form. Okay, so we create this, we open this file. This one, it's mostly PHP, but it will need to, it can display the information. So we can do HTML. And in here, we're going to have the head section. And then here, the close head. And then in the body section, okay, so we got the body section also. So this is where we're going to add our PHP tags so that we can basically show our solution. So here, let's add the PHP tags. So if you remember from, you know, from the break, before the break, I mean. Okay, we can add here our closing tags as well. All right, so now in here, let's add our code. So what do we need? We need, we basically need the get product ID and product name. So we can get it from the get request, get array, or from the request array. So in this case, let's just try that. So I'm going to do, let's say retrieve. This is a comment. Retrieve name value pairs. Right, from array, from request, let's say, to be more explicit. So we're going to say from request. Okay, so then we can proceed here. We're just going to create a couple of variables. Let's call them ID, and to this we're going to assign from request. From request, we can look up the parameters. So I'm going to look up product ID. Remember, this has to match the name in the form. So this is product ID. Okay, and then we repeat the same for the name. So I'm going to do $name, and I'm going to assign to it from request product name. So this is product name. All right, so I have my two parameters here. Now, before in the previous problem, all we did is we took those values and we echoed them out to the screen. But this time around, we are going to create an object. So we're going to do a class called product. And so that's going to be, because of MVC and how we want to organize things a little bit better, you can think of that as a class script or a utility script. We're going to have that code in an entirely separate file. But we're going to bring in that code here. So this is where we can do the introduction of that other file. So we can say include the product class definition. So this is something that, of course, we have to create. So then we're going to do include once, and we're going to include a new file that we need to create. We're going to call it product.php. Does this make sense, guys? Questions?
So far makes sense.
Great. All right, so I really like this style of MVC. I think maybe it might take a while, but eventually this because you can reuse these files across other files, so that there's that. It makes the coding just much more efficient. I think it's things are better organized, more logically. So I definitely like this style. And so here then, now a lot of code that will go in that file will just be a separate PHP file. So now that this has been created, we're going to come back to it. But first, we want to define the class so that we can later use it in here. So let's go ahead and do Control X, Y. We save it. So the file has been saved. And now we can go ahead and start our third file, which we called product.php. So we called our file product.php, and that's where we want to now store our data. All right, so then let's open up the new file, and then now we're going to create our details for it. Okay, so I'm going to do, this is a pure PHP file, therefore, no HTML tags, because think of it as, you're just going to copy this code into that other file that we just defined. Okay, so just like that. That's all that we're going to have in here, and then now we can start defining the product class, right? So I'm going to go over here, right there, and I can say, let's add a comment maybe. Let's just say the product class definition. Should be simple enough. And then we can, like the traditional, just like we saw in JavaScript, pretty standard. So we create the class product, open curly bracket, close curly bracket. All right. And then now that we have it, you know the elements of classes and object-oriented programming. You have private and public variables. You have constructors. You have, and then you have functions, right? Functions to retrieve your data. So in this case, we are going to declare a couple of, just, for this example, let's declare a couple of private variables. So let's say, declare private variables, right? Attributes, whatever you want to call them. And then now let's, obviously what are they going to be? They're going to be the product ID, and the product name. Just, the same ones that we have in the form. So product name. So we're going to store these on here. All right. And that way, because they're private, they really can only be accessed through okay, so we have, we're going to access these through some functions. We're also going to define the default constructor. So let's just, define a constructor. Let's just say default constructor. As you know, those are very widely used. All right, so let's define the first constructor is going to be a function, so we can call it function. And then let's do, usually they have something like this. So 2 underscores construct. Okay, so construct. All right, and then now, again, we open curly bracket, close curly bracket. Right, and in here then, now just like with other languages where, you know, like in Python, you use the word self, right? In here in PHP, we're gonna use the keyword this. Okay, so this. And that just indicates, okay, you know, this object. So whenever I'm making a reference, I'm making to this. So in this case, I'm gonna refer to product ID and product name through the this element of that object. So I can say product ID, okay? And for now in the constructor, just to keep things simple, let's initialize it basically to nothing. And then you can do the same for the product name. So basically the same. So this, oops. And then notice the use of the arrow. Product name. And you can see I'm missing something there. I'm missing the $. So now product name and assigned to this, you know, double quotes again. We're just kind of simply initializing this, nothing else. All right, so that's our basic approach so far. Okay. We've got our function. Let me save this before something happens and I lose the data. All right, so I have it. Going back to it, okay. Now that I have, you know, I'm not really doing much with the constructor, but now let's set up a couple of methods or functions. So we're going to need a function to set the ID. We're going to need a function to set the name, right? If we don't want to set it through the constructor or when it, you know, when it varies over time. And then we're going to need a function to get the ID, to get the name, and then maybe one last function where we would do the echo. So instead of doing the echo in the other file, now we can just do it directly. We can have a method in the class that takes care of that. Okay, so that will be, that's the approach that we can take. So let's go ahead and create these functions, right? So I'm going to create, so function. Let's start with, so we have to set a few of these. So set ID, right? So we have the first one. Set ID assumes you have a new ID, so then $, ID, like that, okay? And then we can define, you know, open curly bracket, close curly bracket. All right, and all we want to do here is we call this object, right? And we assign to product ID we can assign to product ID now. One thing you should notice, let's see something here. If I do, we're going to try this like that. Okay, so I think given that we just have the $sign in front here, we don't have to use the $sign here. So let's see how that goes. All right, so let's do product ID, just like that. And let's do product ID, oops, ID. And let's assign to this $sign ID like that. All right, so let's see what happens with that one. We can actually, and that should be it, right? So that should be it for that function. We can then also do the other function for ID. Let's call it function get ID. So in this case, we can now get the ID, so we don't need to pass a parameter to this one. Open the curly bracket, close curly bracket, and now we would basically return a value, right? So if we're getting something, we would say return $, this, and the value would be ID. So then we can do product ID. Now, before we continue, let's just test this out. So I'm going to do echo, and I'm going to say, you know, $, this, product ID. This is just a good stopping point to test out the class, right? So let's go ahead and save it. All right, and if there are no mistakes, everything should have worked. So let's go to the browser. Let's refresh here, and let's just do add a product. So you're gonna say 002, and then the, you know, this is gonna be a hammer. All right, so now let's send it. Let's see, it should print basically. Okay, and it didn't work. Didn't like that. All right, we are in product ID. We sent the number, we sent the name. Okay, so then we must have an error somewhere. Let's go ahead. So let's look at.
Could it be because in OOP.php there's no, you didn't call the method at all? You set up in product, or the function, I mean?
I didn't create the object, you mean, right? Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Very good point. All right, so to test it, exactly, to test it, I still need to do a couple of things here, right? So I need to call the product, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's create the object. So it should be as simple as saying something like product equal new, and then it is product. The class, I think, is uppercase P. So hopefully that's how I did it. So product, basically like that. Okay. And then once I have this, now what would I need to do? I need to set it first. And then once I set it, I need to get it basically, right? And hopefully at that point it'll print. So let's say I created the product here. Okay, so I have that. Then I'm going to call product, and I'm going to say set ID, right? Set ID, I need to set it to ID basically, right? Oops, not that one, but this one. So I need to set it to this one here. And then now the final part, and hopefully this then will echo out the value, is I need to get ID. So I don't need to do an echo because I have an echo in the other one. So I can just say product get ID, just like that, with no parameter. And hopefully now this will print. So let's go ahead. You can try it on your own. All right, so that's saved. Let's go back to the form. Let's refresh. Let's try another ID. Try another product. So nail. So now I'm going to hit send. Ah, there it is. It works just fine. All right, so that, that's evidence that it works. So let's go back. And as you can see, we can summarize what we did in OOP. So far, basically, we included the file, product.php. We got the ID and the name from the request variable, or we could have used the get array as well. And then we created we did these 3 steps. We created the new product, basically, from the class. and then we just set it, and then get it. All right, so that shows the pipeline working. Now we can just wrap up our class. So we have a few other functions that what I was doing before was just kind of for debugging purposes. Oops. So now I want to bring back product PHP. Just want to take a look at it. And I'm just going to finish it. So, I got the constructor, I got the set method and the get method. I can take out this echo. That was just for debugging purposes. Okay, and now I'm just going to do the next step for the product name. Okay, so I'm going to do here, remember within the class, I'm going to create, the set. So I need to do the set name first, right? So I'm going to create the function set name, and I'm going to set this to, what did we call this? Doesn't matter. We can call it name, right? That shouldn't matter. And then now open up, oops. So open curly bracket, close curly bracket, and then now in set name, we just, once again, call this, right? And then now we can say product name, and we're going to assign to it the variable name, the argument basically that we're passing to the function, and that's it. That assigns the value, and now we can do the get. So this was the set. Now we can do the get. So I'm going to do function, so get name. Okay. And I'm going to open curly bracket, close curly bracket. Okay, and to get name, it should be pretty much the same thing. Just do a return $ this and product name. All right, so product name gets returned, and finally, then we have all our sets and gets, but we now want to have a function called display, and this function will take care of doing the printing. So I'm going to call it, display. Doesn't need to take any parameters. It's just going to use the built-in variables. And then in here now, we need to do an echo. So we're going to do an echo for the product ID and an echo for the product name. So let's do then echo. Let's do product ID. Okay. And then we're going to concatenate, so we can add the dot. And then now we concatenate it with $ this. And we're going to make a reference to the get ID function. So I'm just going to say get ID, just like that. And then we concatenate it with, a tag, a break line tag, so it just looks a little bit more presentable. And then let's do a single quote there. Then let's repeat the process for the other parameters. So we're going to do echo. This is product name. Product name. We're going to concatenate there. And then this is going to be $ this get name. Get name. And, let's add the break line again. So we are like that. And finally, semicolon. And that should be it. That completes this exercise. So if everything worked out, we'll be able to see this in the page OP. All right, so you can see the whole, these are simplified versions of doing MVC, but it makes it, very interesting. All right, so now let's go ahead and save it and let's test everything. So we can go to the browser. Let's go back to this one. I'm going to refresh. I'm going to send, 016. And let's just say would or something. Now, this will follow the entire pipeline. So if we hit send, and it doesn't work.
I don't think you ever called the display function
Oh,
in
that's
OOP.
forgetting that. Huh? Yeah, that's right. So then let's go back here. We go to OOP, right? So same error I made before. Now I've initialized get ID, but I need to do the other ones, obviously. So I'm going to repeat that. I need to get, let's see, I've got both in the request, ID and name. So I got those variables. Now I need to set. So this get ID we don't need. So let's get rid of it. That was just for debugging purposes. So actually then, right here, I'm just going to do the same. I'm going to say product and set. So it's got to be set name. What do we set it to? We set it to those variables $name. Right, so I have that there. And now the final step, if everything is correct, is to print out the results so that we can call the object again. So we can do product display. Product display. Okay, so now if everything is correct, this should work. So let's try it out. So I'm going to hit Control X, Y, go back to the browser, refresh yet again. Let's do 201, 2001 is fine, doesn't matter. This could be glue. All right, and now I'm going to hit send, and there it is. It works perfect. Now, the advantage to this, remember, is, for instance, a class, an object would be something that you would use across your entire website, right? So you can just create one class file, and then from all of your multiple pages, that need to display information, you could just call that class, or a lot of utility functions, etc., and that'll just make your life a lot easier. So when you have to update something in your website, you really just update this one file. And the effect will take for all of them. Remember, we're using PHP and we're using server-side scripting. Okay? All right, so that is the example for object-oriented programming with PHP for a website. Are there any questions?
I don't think so.
No questions. All right, excellent. All right, so those were the, you can see it's pretty straightforward, so hopefully it's starting to all come together. All right, so now I'm done with the simple examples. One big topic that we need to do is databases. I plan to do that, or not teaching you SQL, right? Just showing you how to make the connections to a database, how to display results from a database. We will do that Tuesday, so next week will be just kind of databases. We should be able to do that easily in a day, and you'll have that code for your reference. Okay, so on on Thursday, I will be assigning the homework, which is going to be the PHP grade calculator. All right, so I'm getting a question. Will we need to make secure transfers for our project? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by your question? Will we need to make secure transfers for our project? Oh, you mean like, right, got it, okay. So SQL injection proof and all of that is a topic for ITS 450, okay? Which if you guys remember at some point in the semester, I said that a lot of those things related to web security, such as SQL injection, cross-site scripting, which is basically SQL injection or JavaScript injections, right? Will be covered with a whole bunch of labs in ITS 450. So the purpose of this class is really just to get you guys, you know, started with coding, you know, dynamic web applications with MVC. So since you asked the question, usually what you do with SQL injections is you want to separate the code from the data, right? And that usually can be done very effectively by, first of all, by several methods. One of them is by, you know, usually you want to escape the single quote character. So there's a character called a single quote. Close this. Single quote just looks like that, right? So that single quote is the most evil the most evil character in SQL. All right, so that's, you know, usually you escape that character, but usually there's a technique called prepared statements. And the prepared statement is really one of the most effective things that you can do to prevent SQL injections. So we'll see that. We'll do a lab just on SQL injections, but that's more of a 450 topic. You know, JavaScript injections, all of those. Usually what you do with all of these is the solution is input validation. So what that means is you always want to validate your inputs, right? So if there's a single quote for a SQL injection, escape it. You use a lot of regular expressions, and actually you do it on the client side. You know, you're going to use JavaScript to strip characters, you know, to kind of validate inputs, okay? And I think your question came possibly because you saw with the class, I assume this is where your question came, is that you assume, okay, well, if I'm doing something like set ID, before I set it, can I actually validate it? Can I do input validation here? And the answer is, yeah, sure, you could do that. Just remember, this is actually on the server side, so you really don't even want those characters to make it to the server side. So whenever you deal with input validation, you can use JavaScript on the client side for that. I'm not going to make any requests of input validation for this project, given that that in itself can be pretty bit, you know, involved. And so, yeah. Now, I should say the other thing is encryption, right? So you probably, you know, because you're sending your username and password, right? So that's definitely one thing that we need to talk about. So that's actually what we were about to start. So if you're looking at the whiteboard here, you can see that, let me grab a pen. So you can see that, you know, you're going to have, so we're moving into this idea. We're going to create a website, a more complex website. So we have, let's say something like this, right? And you have your login, you know, and password, and then there's a button here somewhere. So then you're going to log in to the server, right? To the server, which is PHP, you know, the web server basically. But you could also have your database in another server. That's certainly possible. And they could be all over the internet, right? So that, you know, so when you make this connection over here, right? You know, you're going to be sending your user and password. So how do you secure against this? You usually secure through what? What means do you use for this? Right, exactly. So crypto, right? So you can just say cryptography. So we need to create a secure tunnel. Now, if you remember, you already know how to do that because this was a topic from ITS 350. If you remember the PKI lab server, that's exactly what you did. So that is a sysadmin thing, okay? Where you have to do the configuration on the server side. So on the server, if you remember the whole idea of public and private key, and in particular, the certificate authority. So if you remember in that class, we did what was called a self-signed certificate. Do you guys remember that?
Yeah.
Excellent. So then, you know, the browser, if you remember, the browser initializes, right? So from the browser, let's say this is Firefox, and you guys should remember that, hopefully. So the browser initialized the encrypted connection because you already have the keys, and then the server, you know, is listening on for encryption as well. And so you basically create the tunnel there, the encryption scheme, and then when you send your username and password through there, you know, even though they're going over the insecure internet, whether they're going to the database or the logic, it doesn't matter because nobody can sniff those and you know, affect things. So then really security of web applications, so in summary, security for web applications involves at least these two things, right? Here in the text boxes, the text boxes are your biggest threat. So in the text boxes, what do? You do input validation, okay? So input validation here. Right, so you're used to, for instance, you know, usernames are usually, you know, the emails. So does it have an @ sign, right? So that's a type of input validation, but you can also escape for strange characters, etc. Okay, and so that is how you do it. So you basically input validate on the client side. So this is, you know, it's recommended that be done on the client side with, you know, like JavaScript, right? And then obviously you need to put on your sysadmin hat, right? And you will go to your Linux server. Let's say, you know, we're using Linux, and then you would follow, you know, go into the terminal, do all the configuration to basically what you did in the PKI lab. I think it was like the third lab in 350. After that, after you do that successfully, you'll have an encrypted tunnel. You have inputs validated. You also hash the passwords inside your code. This is done in PHP, and then that should give you a lot of security. Make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Perfect. Now, you could do this if you want for your term project, for instance. You can configure the cryptography, the PKI. However, I'm not making that a requirement. Okay, so my focus is just on the coding side of this, right? So I really just want you to do the PHP coding correctly. However, if you want to, you can do input validation. If you want to, you can do the encrypted tunnel between the server, you know, for the server and any client, or the database and any client. Remember, those are things that are independent of MySQL and PHP. They are purely a Linux thing. Now, if you, for instance, let's say that you're hosting in the cloud. Say if you're hosting in the cloud, I should say that. So like, you know, like I have a server for this class, as you guys probably have seen, and it does not have a Sure. If any of you want to do the crypto part, I can give you bonus points. It can be a little bit challenging sometimes, so that's why I'd rather not make it a requirement, but I can give bonus points for sure if you want to do it. No problem. And as I said, the lab, what I would recommend is what I always recommend. Look up what version. I think it's 1804, what was given to you guys, the LAMP server for the project. So look up how to set up PKI for 1804 Ubuntu. And then you'll find a lot of information online, and you should always install for the appropriate version. Now, what was I saying? Oh, yeah, the cloud. So if you're in the cloud, so you've probably seen like the course website does not have a certificate. And that's, I have a certificate for another site, but I got to pay, right? So I don't want to pay for, there's no need. Now, the reason why I don't have it, I don't have a PKI or anything like that for that website, is that for a website, you literally have to pay. If you have a domain, you have to go in and you have to pay GoDaddy or one of those. GoDaddy is pretty cheap actually for that, but still, you got to make those payments. So I chose not to do that because there's no need. If you guys are not sending any information. If I had made the course website where you have to log in or something like that, then yes, of course, it would definitely have to have a certificate, but an SSL certificate. But in my case, for the website, that's not needed. However, in situations like this one, where you have a login, right? If you have a login, you definitely need to secure your website with input validation. Also have the encryption. And the third thing, before I forget, is remember, let's say you're sending your data about, and we'll see this probably next week, when you have your username and password, you're sending your data, to the PHP files here. The PHP files here then will run, and then we'll make the connection to the database, right? So really, I should have done it like that. And so, so it's going to be from the server side. It's going to make that connection there. So the other thing is the PHP file, when it gets its data, even though it's been cleaned, right? So the data has been cleaned here. It would be important that you have, for the SQL injection, for instance, a prepared statement. Prepared statement. And that goes here. As I said, there's also issues with JavaScript. JavaScript can actually be just as, there's something called cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, things like that, that can be pretty, bad for security of web. However, those are such big topics, right, that I just can't, they would take too many weeks of 362 to cover. And therefore, we just move those topics to the course that we have appropriately named, which is 450, software assurance, right? So software assurance deals with half web and half like C++ issues. So anyway, don't worry about those topics. All of that will be covered in 450. But the focus here is mainly, as I said, just more on the coding side. All right, so that's, what else did I want to say? Yeah, so I think I've mentioned everything that I wanted to say, so. All right, are there, I guess, since, are there any questions about anything I just said? All right, doesn't sound like there's any questions, I think. Okay, I'm not hearing any questions, so let's then go back to the virtual machine. All right, so we are back here. Should probably save that just in case. All right. Now on Thursday, we are going to, it's gonna, it's a lab on Thursday, so you will start working on your homework assignment. So on that day, I will give you all right, so on Thursday we will go over the homework details, right? So on Wednesday I'm going to Thursday I'm going to go over the some more details of how to do the homework. So it's basically a PHP grade calculator, which will have an if statement to, like we did, before spring break. So we either show the form or we show the results. Okay, so that we'll take it'll be very simple. It's mainly focused on PHP, but as you might imagine, you have to do the same things, which are calculate the grade, calculate the percentage grade, calculate the letter grade, and show it, basically. So we'll do that we will do that on Thursday. Okay, so just give me a sec. Just give me a sec, guys. All right, so as I was saying, so we're going to do that assignment. We're going to talk about the assignment on Thursday. All right, and then we're going to talk about databases on next Tuesday. So now we are ready then to start thinking about doing, a more complex website. Okay, so we're going to build a more complex website that will be the website for your term project. Okay, so let's let's switch back actually to here. Oh, that's right. So next Tuesday is the exam. Thanks for reminding me. So after the exam, then we'll take a look at the database information. All right. So thank you. So let's think about this now. So we're going to create a website. All right, so let's think about the website that we want to build. So we want to build, you know, a form like this, right? So we're going to have some kind of a menu. We have some menu, and we're going to have, home, and then we're going to have, some information here. Now, this website actually will be made up Okay, so here you have the website. We're going to have a header, we're going to have a footer, and we're going to have the body. So this is the header, this is the footer, and then this is the body. Okay? So now this usually would be just a single website, right? So a single HTML or a single PHP file, but now we're going to think about how to separate our files or our parts of our web pages into different components. And the reason why we want to do it like this, separate it out into 3 files. So this would be like file, let's actually say this would be this would be the header.htm. So this would be header.htm. This would be footer.htm. And then this would be something in the middle, right? So let's say body. And then this, because this might be logic, this could be PHP. Okay? So we're going to separate it out. Instead of just having one single file, we're going to think of separating things out into parts. And this is called MVC. All right? Model view control. So we're going to start to separate things out based on, are they logic or are they presentation? So usually the header and footer, will kind of be presentation. The control will be logic, and then the model will be the data. Okay? So now, why do we want to separate? Because this is going to give us a lot more files, but there's actually a benefit to doing this, okay? If you think about it, when you build a website, you will have a lot of pages. But you usually might want all of your pages to have a certain look, right? You want the menu to be consistent, the header information to be consistent, also the footer. So imagine if you create all these files with these components kind of in all of them. Let's say that then you realize that you want to change. Let's imagine that you want to change one of them for whatever reason. So you would have to go in, change this one, then change that one, then change that one manually, right? But if you separate certain parts that are common, right? If you separate out certain parts that are common, then all you need to do is modify one. So it's like you have one master for header, one master for header, one master for footer, right? And then the files, basically, when you make a change, they're being just added or appended to your HTML site. Okay, so you do something like this, right? And then in the footer, the same thing. You just need to modify one, and it'll save you a ton of time. So that's an example of how model view control kind of works. Okay, so this is the idea. And so that's what we're going to do. So we're going to think about how we can create, you know, one single header, right? And that's going to be an HTML file. One single footer, and that's going to be one HTML file. And then here, these are the parts that are going to change, right? You know, whatever logic we have. And we've already seen a mechanism that allows us to do this, right? So when we create a PHP file, oops. So when we create a PHP file, so .php, we know that we can use the include, right? And the include, just like we saw today in the example of adding the OOP, right? So adding the O to OOP, we can do the same to add other things. Like we could say, well, I want to add a header. And you know what? Down here, I want to add footer. Okay, so you can do this approach, and that way you can always have a separate file and bring it in, right? And then your PHP logic would be, you know, somewhere in here, right? So you'd have, you know, your PHP, let's say here, you know, sorry, you have your PHP here, etc., and your information goes on here. Okay, so this is the basic approach that, you know, we can use this mechanism to kind of implement, separate out pieces of the code so that it's a little bit better. So that's, you know, that's what we're going to do now. All right, so we're going to start this idea. We're going to try to create a file, and this file now will have various parts of it in other files. Okay, and that's how we're going to start. So this, today we were going to start this, but it's going to take us a while for us to basically finish this. But hopefully this idea makes sense, okay? So our goal now in the next few weeks is going to be to create one single file that you can basically use for your term project. We will also have something like, you know, a user and password. Okay, so a username and password where you add the information to this form. Okay, so that's basically the plan. All right, so let's go ahead and get started then with this example. All right, so we're going to create a new file. So let's go ahead and leave the whiteboard. Let's go back to the virtual machine. Go back to the virtual machine. All right, so we're here. All right, so we're going to start the first page, and let's just say we're going to call that page index.php. Okay, so we're going to call that page index.php. I'm going to do index.php. All right, and let's just do, notice I'm not even going to add any HTML. You got to sort of pay attention where you're putting. So the page still will need to render an HTML, you know, the formatting, right? So we still need to figure out where that will go. Okay. So let's do here. What do we need? So let's start thinking about the components that we're going to need. So we need, let's say that we have some configuration files or some configuration information. So we can do a require, and let's just say we have a config.inc.php. This will be a file if we ever have anything that, some configuration parameters that are useful for every website, we're going to store them there. Okay. Obviously, that page needs to exist. Okay. So that's the first one. All right. The next one is I'm going to require, the database. All right. So this is going to be, my database. Now, because the database can change, the location, the server, the information, it might make sense to just reference a variable, like very much like a symbolic link in Linux, this idea. So I'm going to have a variable called MySQL. Now, where can we define this variable? We could define it, for instance, in config.inc.php. Okay, so that just allows us to make code that's a little bit more succinct, more easier to understand. So here we have require basically, okay, for the database. And that way, if you notice, that's pretty much all we have to do. We don't have to put in the username and password in every single file in our website. In fact, that's just going to be done somewhere in some other file, right? And we just do it once. So again, if we have to make a change to those parameters, we don't have to go to every single page. We only go to that one page, and this just calls that file basically. Okay, so that's the first thing that we're going to do. So let me save this. All right, let me look at something. All right, so back to the file. Okay, so we have MySQL there. Now the next step is, okay, what about the header, right? So now let's think about the idea that I was saying, that we could have a header information. So I'm going to do another include, and I'm going to have a file called header.html, right? And you can see that that file basically will contain some information about the header that we can use throughout the website. At the end, we could have another file. Let's call it require. Remember, require will give an error for the entire website if something fails. Include, the page continues, but it doesn't bring in the code obviously if it can't find it. So here we do require, and this would be the footer. So we do footer.html, for instance. Now these could have also the paths if you have another folder somewhere where you're storing these. Like if you start to create a folder for all of your HTML files, a folder for CSS, a folder for JS, and so on. Okay, but if you notice, with this approach, we haven't really written any code, right? We haven't really written any code except for the requires or the includes. But here we are now bringing in the config inc PHP file that allows us to do set up some parameters like MySQL, right? And then after that, we set up the header and the footer. Does this idea make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, so this is, as I said, this is the approach that we're going to take going forward with the rest of the semester in PHP, just so that we can build a much more complex website. But as I said, imagine that you had a website that has 200 pages, and you want to change the header, for all 200. This way you only have to make the change once in the header file, and that's it. All right, so once we've done this, you know, we've got our PHP code here. And then, so we got the header, we've got the footer, and then maybe somewhere in there, then you would have your PHP logic. So in here, then, you know, we would do like, you know, PHP, or you would, well, actually we have the PHP. So then here you could just write, you know, your logic. So usually here, this will be something related to the database. Logic related to getting data from database. Okay, so that's where that would go. All right, so so that's the approach. So now let's think then, well, let's take a look at this. So let's start with the first one, right? Because we don't want to have really any errors. So let's start with this one. Now, why did I call it config inc PHP? It's just a convention. Config just means configuration parameters. And the inc might mean that you have like an includes folder, right? So maybe you have a folder called includes, and that's where you put all these configuration files. All right, so let's go ahead and think about the config inc. So let me see if I can find this. All right, so let's think about that one. So config inc. So I'm going to save, Control X, right? And now I'm going to create a new file, config.inc.php. All right. So let's open that file. Okay. All right. And what do we need in here? First of all, we want to define what MySQL means, right? So in this case, we can use the keyword define in here, and we can say define MySQL as, and then what do we want it to be? Well, the name of the file and its path. Okay, so in this case, mysql.inc.php. This is another file that you're going to use to store database information. Okay, so now you can see the mapping. So whenever we bring in config inc PHP, we now have access to the variable MySQL, and then that is mapped to MySQL inc PHP. So then now we need to create that file, which will have the information for the database connection. Okay, and then here we can have other things. So let's just say for now, we could define, for instance, we could define a base URL, for instance. That's something we can do. So I can write define, and I can say something like base URL, right? Base URL, and then, you know, that's going to be, let's just say for now, localhost, but this could be actually, if you have a domain, you know, some specific information about your domain. So in our case, let's just say localhost. Okay, so we define these parameters, and that way we can just use this directly throughout the entire website. And then on here we can have other utility functions. So we can say here, for instance, other utility functions, right, that we might use. So one, for instance, that we might define later is the redirect function. So redirect function, okay? So what is this one? This is a function that, you know, whenever a user is not currently logged in, right? So whenever somebody is not logged in, it checks that they're logged in. If they're not logged in, it redirects them to the login page, for instance. So that's a very common thing in some websites. And so that's something that you can define here. So you have that function specified in your code, and then you can just bring it in from here, right, by using the include. So now that we've done that, we need to then, if you notice, now we're calling MySQL Inc. PHP. Okay, so let's take a look at, so we need to create that file. So we're going to create MySQL. All right, so we're going to do save this one, Control X, Y, and then now MySQL.inc.php. Oops. So notice there will only be one file. Okay, there will only be one file that handles database connections. All right, so let's go ahead and open it. All right, so mysql.inc.php. Again, you know, it's a PHP file. PHP, right? And then now in here, so let's just write some information about this one. This, let's say this file contains, you know, the database information. You know, it establishes a connection to MySQL, right? And selects the database. Database, so that, you know, there's a lot of ways that we can do this. So it's important, you know, kind of to put in some information in here. All right, we might also have the hashing function in here. The database is, okay, we can also say it includes a hashing function for the password. Okay, so that's basically the idea. All right, so what do we need then to make a connection? You know, we need to define here some parameters, right? So we need to define the 4 things really that we need to make a database connection. So we're going to say, or actually let's add a comment here. Let's just say set the database access information as constants, let's say. All right, so what is this information? We're going to use define. I'm going to create the DB user. So database user. And then here, you know, this is where you have to kind of hard code the parameters. So this is definitely a file that you want to keep in a folder. You kind of want to make sure that it's a secure place where you have it. Now, keep in mind, because it's a PHP file, anybody that was able to access this file and run it, you know, would not be able to see this information, because remember, PHP results do not show on a browser. However, anybody in your, you know, like a developer, right, might be able to see the file if they're checking the Linux file system. But as far as from the web, they would not be able to see these parameters. So usually here, it would be the username, the password, you know, the URL of where your data is. So let's say, for instance, just for the sake of argument, that you're doing here, you rented the server, you're hosting it in the cloud, right? So you have, you know, GoDaddy or something like that. So let's say then you would have, you know, your user would be, you know, I don't know, you know, B Smith, right? Something B Smith, and then you would have a password, you know, define, and you would do DB password. Okay, and then you would put in here some password, right? So probably some, you know, something that they're gonna give you, right? So they give you some password there. So just type something randomly. Okay, and those are the things that you need to make a connection. Then the next thing they're going to give you is they will give you a the host, right? So it's going to be the database host. That's going to be the URL of where you're storing things. So the DB, let's call this DB host. That's that other server. So DB host, comma, and then here it would be literally like the URL. So for instance, I don't know, you know, go, you know, DB23 or DB23 dot, you know, GoDaddy something, let's just say .com, something like that, right? And they would give you that host, or it could be an IP address. You could, you know, you could say also it's a specific IP address. So we could do, you know, 205.215, you know, 11, I don't know, 14.13, something like that. So you have the URL or where the database is actually hosted, and then finally you define the database name. So you know, in MySQL, as you probably have seen, you have several databases that you can create. If you're doing this again in the cloud, you would basically get a limit. I think they you know, you pay a certain amount of money in the cloud and they'll give you, you know, 15 databases or so. So let's say here you would do DB name, right? And then you're going to have, you know, the database name. So in our example here, let's say that for your project, right? So this is for your term project. So you're just going to say, maybe you are going to call your database 362 project. Okay. As we start doing examples this semester, or we continue to do examples this semester, this would change obviously with different databases that we want to use. But that's basically what you do, as you can see in this file, right? So you only do it once. You can define these parameters: username, password, the host, and the database name. Okay, so I think it's pretty self-explanatory. And then once you've done this, you create the actual connection. So you make the connection here with the database. And sometimes you can have some logic to see if, you know, something was made correctly, etc. But make the connection goes here. And then really what you do is you kind of create like a, you can create like a variable. Let's call it DBC. So DBC connection, database connection. And then here you have to decide what you're going to use to interact with MySQL. So PHP actually has several ways of interacting with databases. There's, for some of the seed labs, for instance, that actually going back to that class ITS 450, the seed labs use MySQL, MySQL I _connect, okay? So it uses this type of an approach. So if you've ever seen it before, this might be familiar to you. So MySQL I connect, and it uses that kind of approach to make database connections and query the database. There's something else called PDO. So there's various ways that you could do this, and so these are things that certainly we can talk about later. For now, we're not going to be making any database connections yet. Now, for this going forward, probably next week, one of the things that I will make available is an SQL script. So I will post an SQL script on Blackboard. You will need to download that script and then run it on your PHP MyAdmin to create the databases and everything. So now, let's kind of now go back to this. Now I'm assuming this is just for the VM, right? So just for the VM, I'm assuming that 1804 LAMP probably uses root as the user. That's what I probably assume. I also assume that the password is probably tour. I think that's the one I've been typing. This is going to just be, well, localhost, right? Because now you want to make the connection to this same machine, this VM. And then this, of course, will change depending on the type of database that you're going to create. So that's the name that you provide. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Any questions so far?
No.
All right, no questions. All right, so this is a good stopping point. Okay, so I just wanted to introduce this idea for now. So next, as I said, next Thursday, we will go over I'll assign the homework for PHP, which is a great calculator. It's just, pretty simple. And then next week, as somebody reminded me, is the exam. And then after that, we will come back to this idea and we'll just start building this website. But for now, I think I've given you enough. You can see now if I do Control X, Y, I've created several files, right? So I've created the index PHP, and you've seen that the index PHP calls config inc PHP, and then config inc PHP calls MySQL inc PHP, and you can see how all these files now have little parts of the code that's important to make the entire website. So this will just make our code development a lot more efficient. Okay, a lot more efficient. All right. Any questions? So I'll stay for a few minutes if you guys have any questions. Otherwise, we can stop here for today, and I will see you guys on Thursday.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Right, so somebody is asking me if we will have time to work on the project. Well, actually, what I just started today, this thing that I just started today, you can use for the project, you see? So that's actually the point I'm trying to make, is that I'm creating the general framework upon which you can build the rest of your website. Do you guys see that? So in a sense, you've started working on the project today. All right. All right, so hopefully that made sense. All right, so I'm not giving you the full code, right? I'm just giving you, one code that is so important that most projects would be, could be made around it, and so that's why we have this. All right, so I'll stop the recording at this time. Right, so.